Ja, ik ben gaan reden om uw bloemen mee te brengen, maar het was me zodanig druk, zeg ik ga er niet in slapen. En nu moet ik zo ver staan. Maar je hebt nog bloemen te goed.
Oh, dus,
Want dat zal schitterend
ja.
zijn. Ja. Heb je al een informatie over de restauratie nadien? Ja. Nee, nog niet.
je wil ook tijdens de receptie. Ja, heel leuk. Non, non, c'est un cadeau que j'ai reçu de Christine. Ça me fait tellement plaisir de vous voir. Nicolas.
Gaat u zitten, dames en heren. Hartelijk welkom op deze openbare verdediging die in het Engels is. Welcome everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for being here. Today we have the doctoral examination of Hélène Dubois. After the first meeting of the doctoral students and after further deliberation about the merit of the dissertation entitled The Turbulent Material History of the Ghent Altarpiece, an Analysis Integrating Technical Examination and Historical Sources, which was submitted by Hélène Dubois to obtain the degree of Doctor of Art Science, the Doctoral Examination Board has decided that Hélène Dubois has been admitted to the public defense of the dissertation. So you are requested to give a short presentation of the objective and the findings of your research, and you have 20 minutes for doing this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The altarpiece of the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, known internationally as the Ghent Altarpiece, was painted by the brothers Van Eyck over a period of several years. It was unveiled 6 May 1432. The donors were Jos Veit, a prominent and very wealthy citizen of Ghent, and his wife Elizabeth Borluut, who are represented almost life-size on the closed altarpiece. This configuration was the most frequent at the time, here on the left of this slide. The altarpiece was to serve as a support for the daily memorial mass dedicated to the souls of the donors and to their ancestors in their chapel, situated on the side of the high choir of the parish church of St. John in Ghent, now St. Bavo's Cathedral. The altarpiece was open for masses and feasts, but also to present the most precious and important interior scenes to visitors ever since the 15th century. The altarpiece is unique by the combination of its size and its iconographical and technical complexity, but is also probably unique in terms of its material history. It has been subjected to numerous alterations, the consequence of war, iconoclasm, fire, theft, and changes of taste, and last, but certainly not least, to many restorations with varying degrees of success. To the exception of the panels with the Just Judges, stolen in 1934 and never returned, the paintings and their frames are still conserved in the church of which they were painted. Restorations and alteration to the altarpiece were already mentioned in the 16th century, and the material history was researched by scholars in Ghent since the early 19th century, such as Norbert Cornelis and van den Geijn. Periods of the material history have become part of the collective memory and contribute to the Ghent altarpiece's public appeal. They include, for example, the evacuation of the panels in the bell tower during the iconoclastic destructions of 1566, or the seizure of the central panels by French revolutionaries to show them in the Louvre until the fall of Napoleon, or for more from Hitler's horde in the salt mines of Alt-Aussee at the end of the Second World War. My work deals with the main material interventions that have been carried out on the paintings and their frames, particularly restorations and structural transformations between its unveiling in 1432 and 1894, date of a major operation that fundamentally altered the structures of the supports and of the frames of 6 shutters, which were then the property of the picture gallery in Berlin. Research on the material history is an essential component of conservation campaigns, since material interventions profoundly influence the condition of works of art. It is safe to say that the interdisciplinary approach to this work dates back to the 1950s, when the Ghent altarpiece was restored under the direction of Paul Koremans in the National Laboratories of Belgian Museums. This laboratory is the ancestor of the Ryler Institute of Cultural Heritage, which has been in charge of the 2 first phases of the current conservation and restoration campaign. Koremans' approach was completely novel at the time. He associated restorers, art historians, and heritage scientists working together to understand the condition of the altarpiece and to guide decisions during the treatment. At the time, 2 scholars, Roger Marijnissen and Antoine de Schrijver, gathered a systematic overview of all the historical sources they could find on the material history of the altarpiece. The aim of this research was to provide a canvas of historically verifiable data in a positivist approach. Material alterations observed during the restoration itself were connected to these documented events, and this information served to understand the condition of the altarpiece and guide decisions for restoration. This is what happened again in the recent years. However, in the following decennia, several authors contradicted the conclusions made by Koremans and his team. It was thus essential to research the material history again to support the restoration campaign carried out since 2012 and housed in this museum. The exterior of the wings was first treated between 2012 and 2016, and the lower register of the open altarpiece, including the central panel with the Adoration of the Lamb, between 2016 and 2019. The progress in analytical and imaging methods realized since Koromans's time, as well as a much deeper insight in old masters' painting techniques, meant that much more detailed and precise material data could be collected in order to guide the treatment and understand the material history. The treatment was initially addressing conservation and stabilizing issues. But following the discovery in 2013 of very old non-original overpaint, covering over half of the surface of the exterior paintings, and after the meticulous interdisciplinary research followed by an international commission, the focus of the treatment was shifted. A more profound restoration was carried out in order to free the well-preserved original from non-original additions that subdued the extraordinary pictorial quality of the Brothers van Eyck work, and in order to conserve them properly. You can see here a comparison of the drapery of Joost Wijd on the left, covered with 16th century overpaint with soft, rounded folds, compared with the sharp, prismatic, sharp folds of the drapery of the Virgin in Jan van Eyck's Van der Pale Madonna, kept in the Groningen Museum in Bruges. It became even more essential to record, qualify, and understand the different superimposed restorations which could possibly be removed in order to conserve the original. The extended length and complexity of the conservation restoration project also meant that the team of conservators had more time to record and interpret material observation in an interdisciplinary context. The 1951 treatment, in contrast, only lasted 11 months and was basically carried out by one man. The work of art is, after all, the primary source on its material history. Just like historical sources, material traces must be meticulously researched, documented, and critically interpreted. The main question addressed in this research was, to what extent combining historical sources and literature can deductions be made on the condition, the appearance, and the perception of the work of art in a particular period? With material investigation, can abstract historical data become materially concrete and less subjected to wide interpretations? The listed in systematic review of archival data. As you can imagine, historic data was enormous, spanning 5 centuries and very different periods and contexts. Written sources included published descriptions of interventions on the object at a given time, and primary sources, such as expertise, correspondence, conservation, restoration reports, or photographs after the middle of the 19th century. On the basis of this overview and on the basis of the important questions raised during the treatment, I identified areas that demanded further archival research and interpreted technical data with all specialists involved. This included the Institute laboratories, heritage scientists from the University of Ghent and Antwerp, and of course, the conservation team. In conjunction with material discoveries and questions raised during the treatment, I focused on 6 different periods where important alterations were carried out. I first introduced my work on methodology and on the original installation, the function, and usage. The first period concerned was dealing with early damages and restoration and the overpainting campaign preceding Michiel Coxey's copy of 1557-1558. The second period, alteration and restoration following the religious conflicts of the late 16th century and early 17th century. The insertion of the altarpiece in a Baroque portico altar in 1662, the French revolutionary seizures in 1794, and restoration of the central panels in the Louvre, where they were shown until 1815, the conservation and presentation of the central panels and Adam and Eve in Ghent and in Brussels, that is for the period 1816 to 1865, and finally, presentation and restoration of 6 wings sold in 1816 in the museological context of the Berlin collection. Since I can't cover all these subjects, I would like to illustrate the relative contribution of the different disciplines involved in my research with one particular example. In his Chronicle of the History of the Region, published in 1568, Marcus van Warneweg cited an intervention on the altarpiece by the celebrated painters Lancelot Blondel from Bruges and Jan van School from Utrecht. He told that the painters came to Ghent and literally started to wash the painting on the 15th of September 1550, so lovingly so that they cleaned this precious work in many places. They used the expression, in veel plaatsen gekust hebben. Credit was not always given to Van Warneweg's story, and some eminent scholars dismissed it as a complete tale. Paul Goromes and his team thought that the painters may well have been responsible for overpainting some of the interior paintings, and Dan van School, who was a canon of the St. Mary Church in Utrecht, even added the cathedral tower in the landscape. They saw that it was a reworked version of the Adoration of the Lamb that was reproduced by Michiel Coxey, who made a full-scale copy for Philip II in 1557 and 58. Thus, the overpainted must have dated from before that date. When again, very early overpaint was discovered, we came naturally back to this mention. The main question was, could 2 well-established and respected masters based in different cities, Bruges and Utrecht, have directed a restoration that included overpainting such an important and iconic work of art? Could the technical analysis combined to deeper art historical insight lead to a firm conclusion? The analysis of microscopic paint samples in the laboratories of the Institute showed that the overpaint layers were separated from the original with 1 to 4 layers of oxidized varnish, as well as thinner overpaint. This showed that the paintings had been varnished several times and even restored before they were overpainted and before they were copied by Coxey. Also, local earlier and very clumsy restorations were identified under the overpaint. Analysis of the overpaint showed that extremely good quality, pure and expensive pigments were used in the overpaint, high-grade azurite, for example, and red kermes slate. And meticulous observation by the conservators also showed that 1 coherent overpainting was present over very large areas of the painting. When laboratory and non-invasive scans came to play, we came to completely understand the condition of the original underneath this overpaint. With the contribution of macro X-ray fluorescence scanning, we were able to estimate the presence of losses in the underlying paint. And this technique is particularly impressive. It's developed and practiced by the University of Antwerp. It can give an image of the presence of particular element in one layer or in several layers. And in the case of the robe of Elisabeth Borluut, the original was painted with lead white and was overpainted with a copper-based pigment azurite. So the lead map showed the condition of the original, and the copper map showed the condition of the overpaint. And you can see on the left of the slide, the black stains is where there was no signal. So this where there was a loss of paint underneath the overpaint, and though you could see that the damage was extremely limited, something that was absolutely not understood with traditional technique. From this technical data could be deduced that from a purely pragmatic point of view, the paintings must have looked quite dull, covered with dark varnishes and local restoration before they were overpainted. The restoration made them appear in flawless condition. The shapes were followed carefully, but the folds of the draperies and the vegetation in the landscapes, for example, were simplified. A few details were noticeably altered, for example, the head of the lamb, which I will return to later. This restoration campaign was as well prepared and carried out with care before 57, since the overpainted version had been copied by Coxey. It involved skilled painters and expensive pigments and must have been an important investment. Now let's consider the date. In fact, the 15th of September 1550, which is a very unusually precise date for Van Warnewijk's chronicle, is also the date of a generous gift of 15,000 Italian crowns issued by the Council of Finance of the Imperial Court to complete the construction of the nave of St. John's Church, where the altarpiece is housed. The donation was very well known in the city. It seems thus likely that the overpainting campaign took place in the context of the building work in the church, sponsored by the emperor. The link between St. John's Church and Habsburg was indeed very strong. No direct primary source was found because the accounts of the church are missing for this period, but plenty of circumstantial evidence make it very likely that it was carried out under the responsibility of Jan van Scorel and Lancelot Blondel. Both artists had successful studios and had received import commissions from the Habsburg. The spider in the web of this enterprise may have been Antoine Perrenot, future Cardinal of Granvelle, advisor to the emperor and avid art collector. He knew Van Scorel personally. Perrenot was also a canon of St. Mary's Church, as well as St. George Church here in Ghent. Van Scorel had painted his portrait. Perrenot hired Van Scorel's pupil, Antonis Moore, as his personal painter. Perrenot was also a close friend to the provost of the church, Lucas Munich. And then Blondel had restored paintings for Munich, who also had showed them with pride to Granvelle. Observations made during the treatment showed that, unlikely previously stated, the tower of the Utrecht Cathedral was not added during this restoration, but was overpainted together with the whole horizon, landscape, and sky to cover damages in that area. This intervention appears exceptional for early Netherlandish painting. However, this assessment may be biased by the fact that the combination of the length of the present conservation campaign, allowing for extensive visual examination, and the progress of technical imaging and analytical techniques have revealed far more information on the material history than during any other restoration of early Flemish paintings. Also, we must remember that only about 1% of medieval altarpieces are still conserved in situ in the Low Countries due to destructions and neglect over the centuries. It is still necessary to evaluate the impact of these overpainting campaigns have had on contemporary onlookers. The much discussed changes to the morphology of the lamb may have been motivated for a search for more decorum in the period of the Council of Trent or by other concepts, but this is for further research. The restorers corrected the archaic shape of the head with the expression resemble a human intense, confronting gaze. To conclude, the qualification of the successive interventions separately also contributes to the assessment of the appearance of the altarpiece at a given time and gives insight into its perception by contemporary onlookers. It also obliges us to reevaluate the paradigms associated with the Ghent altarpiece that have influenced reflection on the visual arts. To all who have collaborated with this research and to those who have provided valued guidance and support, thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure and an honor to work with you. So I invite the questions with this. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now start the interrogation, but before that I would like to present the jury members. They will present themselves when they start asking questions, but nevertheless I give you the overview. My name is Marc Leman. I am professor in musicology at Ghent University. My role here is basically a formal role to make sure that things go smoothly in a formal way. The content and let's say the interrogation about the content of the PhD will be done by voting members of the jury. On my left-hand side, we have Jørgen Vadum from Denmark. We have Anne van Grevenstein from the Netherlands. And at my right side, we have Anne-Laure van Bruane from Ghent University and Koenraad Jongheren from Ghent University. We also have a voting member nominated by the faculty, which is Jaya Ramon, sitting here. And we have, last but not least, a non-voting member, not allowed to ask questions, but the supervisor of this PhD, Professor Maximilian Martens. So I also would like to remind you that this is the second part in the interrogation. The first part took place several weeks ago. We call that the internal defense. That's where very detailed and technical questions are asked. Here we go a level higher and ask questions, let's say, of interest also to the general public, although there might also be some technical questions as well. We will see. We will see. Also, we have a particular order of examination, and the order is related to the distance where the members come from. So the first comes from the farthest away, let's put it like this. And this is Professor Jørgen Vadum. I give you the word.
Thank you very much. Presenting myself, I was trained in art history and paintings conservation, and worked as a paintings conservator in the Netherlands for 15 years and 15 years in Denmark. And now I'm a private enterprise and have a position in writing a catalog raisonné for a Dutch collection in Denmark. Apart from that, dear candidate, allow me to congratulate you very much on the achievement you have made here. It is in size, a small book, but there's so much in it. It's incredible how many details and how much material you have been able to gather. Of course, an old piece of art, very much cherished by the whole world. Polyptych have been thought about and have been discussed in many publications in the past. But I guess you've traced them all and got all this material gathered and looked at it and tried to extract and extrapolate what the meanings have been of all this information. And I think we have a very important piece of historical documentation that has no second. There's nothing second to this. Of course, one could ask several questions, and we discussed first time we met, but I would like to touch upon a question that is a little bit more difficult to get a grip of, maybe. You mentioned in several places the costs associated with various treatments, costs that you found in the archival resources. And I'm particularly happy with one from 1660, which you do not mention, because it has nothing to do with this particular polyptych. It's the Antwerp restorer Mollet who invoiced the art dealer Forkant for in St. Jans predikatie van hij met de bles, nieuwe lucht en versierd gemaakt met azuur, 12 guilders. We don't know, of course, how much there would have been in making that new sky in 1660 to the Hij met de bles. Maybe it's hanging out there in one of the collections with that new sky that was added in 1660. But was it cheap or was it expensive? That's difficult to understand in the old files, because we don't know what they really relate to. But a more realistic comparison could maybe be attempted between the treatments carried out in the 19th century. And there, for example, the Brussels restorer Etienne Leroy, he in 1859 to 60 charged the director of the Mauritshuis 700 guilders for the lining of Rembrandt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. Comparing this to the price charged for the treatment of the panels and frames of Adam and Eve, which De Schrijver and Marijnissen, I quote, considered to have been particularly extensive because of the sum involved, 85 francs, compared to the price required for the 4 central panels and the light cleaning of paintings for the chapter, 400 francs. You mentioned that in the first version of your dissertation on page 165. I think a discussion or a clarification of how these prices are based. Are they based on structural aspects? Are they based on more aesthetical treatments? And how was that evaluated? Was it evaluated by the Kerkfabrik or those in charge? Or is it an evaluation that also reflects the appreciation of that particular work? Is it to the point, or has it other values attached to it when you look at the 19th century prices, which are the latest that you deal with in your dissertation? So I would like to hear your
Thank you very much
this.
for this very important question. I'm very well aware that the prices of the restoration is something I really have not gone into very much because I found it very difficult to find any comparisons. I've tried to make comparisons between restorations of more or less the same period, but very often we have no clear idea in what exactly were these restorations, because the bills mention cleaning, schoonmaak, perhaps some structural work, repareren, herstellen, and very often we just have no idea of what actually has happened, particularly for the older period. Now, do you actually be very interesting, something you mentioned in the internal defense, to compare the prices of this restoration with the prices of works of art. And that would give a better perspective on the value that's attached to this restoration. I think that was absolutely a very, very good suggestion. Also within one period, particularly for the old restoration in the 16th and 17th century, I found also difficult to judge of the rate of the type of payments, also varying very much within the same region. Also, I couldn't really figure out what were the issues of competition and between different restorers possibly. In the old restorations, I haven't seen any evidence of several restorers presenting a different price and a choice for one or the other for a reason or the other. For the 19th century, I think that would be perhaps easier in a way to make these comparisons, also because the archive is much more clear on what actually happened during the restoration. We can find more information on this. And also the monetary system is slightly simpler for someone who's not an economic historian. But I think that would be a great alley of work.
Did you consider looking at prices for works of art being restored, of other altarpieces, polyptychs, triptychs, whatever, in this region? I know it's outside of this.
I have looked at it, for example, for the early 17th century. There are some restoration carried out by David Noveliers in Brussels. He worked on the Justice panel van der Weyden. And he worked also in paintings in Watervliet. But in these cases as well, there's absolutely no mention of what actually happened. He actually worked on the painting, so we know. And so it's difficult to assess, to compare what the prices in that particular case. But I think you have very good suggestion to look into comparisons in the actual price of works of art and to see actually the value that's attached by the owners of the paintings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dear candidate, on my way towards Ghent today, I realized again, we have been working together for such a long time. And my name is, as I said, Anne van Gevenstein. We worked together in Maastricht with the first training program in conservation and restoration, where we decided or had the opportunity to do it on a post-academic level. So bringing together people who had studied art history already, or chemistry, or architecture. So in the students group already, and you were there to, well, as a teacher, in fact. And we worked, of course, together with the urgent conservation at the beginning of the Ghent Altarpiece program. And what has been striking for me over all those years is your ability to build bridges between disciplines, between institutions, between individuals, between universities even. I think the collaboration between the different universities around this program is exceptional and doesn't happen very often. So yes, it is an enormous feast to be here now and to see the results in the beautiful book and publication that you made. And then my character would immediately say, let's go to the future and have a look at research programs like Jörn already did before me. And one of the things, let's take the first chapter of your book, and the immense differences in discussion about the original presentation. And then there's one small path you could go towards, and that is that partition wall in the Fight Chapel between the wall that has been built, but in chapter 2, page 22 now, and note 49, you say, and I'm quoting you, why, so about the partition wall, in the separating wall in the Fight Chapel existed in 1432. And in page 31, you say, unfortunately, all traces of the original anchoring system that may have remained are now hidden by renovations carried out in 1951 and cannot be checked at this stage. So after that, you had discussions with building historians, and I would like you to extrapolate a little bit which direction are those new analysis, because the world of archaeologists and building historians is quite another world than ours of conservation and art history. So interdisciplinarity is again there a big step. So how do you think the dream about finding traces of those original positioning could be searched for?
Thank you very much for your question. I do agree that it would be really an essential component of understanding the initial presentation to be able to do some more research, archaeological research in the chapel. It's something I considered more closely when I was writing my thesis and really getting an overview of all the theories that had been done on this subject, and coming to the right questions. I think that's the first step, is to understand what is exactly the elements could be found that would give us a good indication of the original position. One of them, of course, is, as you mentioned, is to evaluate whether this wall, which is separating the east side of the chapel to the next chapel, could have existed in the 15th century, or whether it was built later. Right. The photos taken in 1950, when the altarpiece was taken away for its restoration, show that it was really a brick wall. Interestingly, on the photos, you can see that the construction method of that brick wall is very similar to pillars that were actually built to support the Baroque portico. And so, purely on the photographs, there seemed to be indication that at least some of this wall may have been built for placing this portico, but it might also have existed partly before that. To come to closure to this, it would be necessary to analyze the mortar and the bricks, which are now hidden under concrete. So it would be necessary to sample, and I've been talking to purely out of interest and finding out whether it would be possible, because of course it's a very difficult operation that would imply, of course, to the cathedral, a lot of other stakeholders. But there are possibilities to date the mortar by looking at its composition and also applying C14 techniques. There are some research programs going on this subject at the moment, so there is potential for this kind of research. So,
thank you very much. Talking about big steps towards interdisciplinarity, I think that is one of the basic things. Try and find traces still, maybe or maybe not, but if you don't look for them, you can't find them. So yeah. Thank you. Yeah. That's enough.
Yeah, now I give the word to Professor Annelore van Bruane.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. So I'm Annelore van Bruane from this university, but from the Department of History, where I am specialized in early modern cultural history. Dear Ms. Dubois, beste HÉLÈNE, the subject of your thesis is in many ways very close to my heart. As a child, I visited the Ghent chapel a few times with my mother, where for the payment for a modest sum, I think it was 5,000 francs, I'm not sure, a grumpy old man manually opened and closed the windows. I went to the primary school in the old convent building next to the cathedral and became convinced that the panel of the judges was hidden under the marble floor or behind the monumental stairs. And when we had to attend Mass in the cathedral, which was quite often, I spent most time looking around for other potential hiding places. I realize now that the Ghent Altarpiece was one of the first encounters with the history of my native city and is the foundation of my greatest professional passion until this day. Like many of us present today, I have followed the restoration campaign you coordinated with great interest. During these years, my admiration for you as a researcher, but also as a person, has grown constantly. You effortlessly combine technical, scientific, and managerial competences. You are an excellent and perfectly trilingual communicator. You radiate an infectious enthusiasm, but always remain very modest about your own abilities. These many qualities are also reflected in your thesis, which is compelling in its intellectual breadth, but also concise, to the point, and no nonsense in its approach. Describing and dissecting almost 500 years of history of one of the most complex works of art, you always avoid falling into the trap of unfounded hypotheses or over-interpretations. You soberly state and analyze the facts and do not hesitate to leave unanswerable questions unanswered. I think this is a true sign of intellectual maturity. Your cautious and balanced approach does not make it easy to formulate major criticism or to question your conclusions. I will nevertheless try to ask you something. The strength of your thesis is, of course, the combination of technical material data and with historical sources. So I would like to ask you a first broad methodological question about this. The success of your method is evident from the results, I think, rather than from a detailed reflection on the possibilities and limitations of your interdisciplinary approach. In your conclusions, however, you briefly sum up the advantages of your method by suggesting that technical and historical data can sometimes reinforce and sometimes complement each other. However, I assume that during your research, there have also been instances when the technical and the historical data have contradicted each other. My question to you is whether this was effectively the case, and if you can give one or more examples, and also if you can explain to us how you have tried to resolve these contradictions.
Thank you for this very challenging question. I think there several examples or where the technical evidence has not contradicted so much the primary historical sources, but previous conclusions which had been made on the basis of the primary sources. And perhaps also conclusions that did not really go deep enough into the historical sources themselves. I'm not saying that the technical evidence is the absolute miracle that explains everything. You also have to dig very deep into the historical data. There's one example I can give for this is to be able to distinguish the different campaigns that have taken place in Ghent in the 19th century. So in the 19th century, the central panels were in Ghent and were restored at least 2 times, as much as we know from the sources which are archived in the cathedral. 2 restorers, as I quoted, and also a picture cleaner who apparently just cleaned the paintings. In the past, the most of the important overpainting that we found during the restoration, so 19th century overpaint, which is carried out with modern pigments, had been attributed to one of the restorer, which is called Doncelar. And the reason for me were not quite clear. I think one reason was that there was not enough historical data collected on this restorer. And also, on the other hand, the examination that was done in 1951 was impeached by the huge amount of varnishes and different area, a lot of dark varnishes on the surface, so they could not really distinguish these recent restorations, which are a bit bundled into each other, which is very different from the earlier overpaint from the 16th century, which had a very typical material characteristics. So I came to the conclusion that it was Jean-François Laurent, just a restorer who worked around 1826, who was responsible for most of the 19th century overpaint on the altarpiece. This was based on the one hand on material analysis of the pigments used and the scans with macro XRF, who showed that he very clearly, there was clear overpainting around a joint between the panel that we know had to be restored at the time of Laurent's restoration. So very broad retouching in that area, particularly logically, were bound to the structural intervention with the panel. So this is why I conclude also on the basis of what more knowledge has been accumulated on modern pigments since 1951, is that in 1951, the analysis of modern retouching identified the presence of cobalt blue and artificial ultramarine. And at the time, they thought that the two pigments were actually combined in one overpaint. But the very fine analytical work done in the laboratories at the Institute showed that there were very clearly 2 layers. One was done with artificial ultramarine and one was done with cobalt blue. And you could, in that sense, see also the one that was done with cobalt blue was very extensive. And we know that this pigment was also accessible to in the early 19th century, and this was used by Laurent. So there was a combination of these, all these data that made it possible then to make this distinction in 19th century, for the 19th century.
So I conclude that the data are correct, but the art historians are wrong.
No, but what's really interesting is that also the technical examinations has their limitations. And since the 1950s, for example, we know a lot more about when modern pigments were actually accessible to artists. The restorers who worked were artists. And so we know that cobalt blue was actually accessible in the early 19th century, which in 1950 people were not aware of this fact. So yeah, this gives more information in that sense. But what I wanted to say, so it's not really the art historians. It was not Marijnissen and the Schrijver who made this distinction. They also connected with the physical data that was available at the time, which was not as refined and as it is now. And so they were all wrong.
Okay, thank you. Now I pass the word to Professor Koenraad Jonkheere.
As the last in line, I can only, well, add a few superlatives to what the colleagues have already said about your dissertation. I think it's a fabulous dissertation in which you, well, not only looked at all the possible sources, you, as our colleague said, found everything, I guess, and really nicely summarized it. And I can only hope that it will be published soon so that it can become part of the scholarly debates, not only on the Ghent Altarpiece, but on restoration history in general, because I think it's a very important addition to that, well, emerging discipline even. As my colleague Anne-Laure said, it's always hard to find questions when a dissertation is that good, but as you know, I did found one and we discussed it before, but I'm going to pose it again because I want to see if you're thinking about the question has changed in the meantime. And the question is as follows: you're a restorer, you worked on the Ghent Altarpiece for quite a long time. And it surprised me to see that you cleverly avoided to discuss the final phase of the restoration history of the Ghent Altarpiece. Of course, excluded your own restoration, which is, I think, correct, but also, let's say, the last 50 years. And what you do not make implicit, I think, in your PhD is the fact that certainly when we talk about restoring paintings, that there are couple of very important but implicit paradigms that we are afraid to name, but which are typical for painting. If you think of architecture, when they restore, say, the cathedral in Tournai, we don't ask the question, shall we take out the Jubilee by Cornelis Floris, which is a 16th century addition to a Gothic church. We just leave it there and we consider it normal. Or if we look at an antique sculpture, which in most cases has Renaissance additions, we just leave them in. But as soon as a painting comes in our view, we all think, and I'm an art historian, so, and I don't judge it, we all think we have to take away all the restorations and additions, etc. And I'd like to know, now that you look back on the restoration history of the Ghent Altarpiece, what do you think of your predecessors, and how much credit do we have to give them when restoring such important works of art in the 21st century? That would be my question.
Thank you for this question, but I just wonder which period I should talk about. Of course, this very intriguing 16th century overpainting has been particularly revealing. It has not been found on paintings from that period, and intriguing also from our own point of view. So we project our own values of not overpainting original work, seem particularly puzzling, I think, not only to the public, but to all, to experts, also to the public as well. It is, in the case of the 16th century, probably directed by Van Schoorl and Blondel. In that case, I think the aim was really to make the painting look absolutely pristine and perfect, and that the restorers then covered, I agree, large areas, but areas which had local damages, and so that the whole, also similar areas were all coherent. So let's say a very damaged drapery, they overpainted it, but then they overpainted also the drapery that was next to it, so that the whole thing would be stylistically coherent. And this is why you have such large areas which are overpainted, but actually the damage is quite limited in itself, in the original. They made some stylistic changes in the draperies, but they're not major. They're just a simplification, but they follow really the contours of the shapes. They're not major changes. They don't add details or change the fashion. They just gave it a different sensibility, and perhaps in a more simple way. The material they use is not so sophisticated. The pigments are a lot grittier. The modeling is much more simple. So there's a question we must ask. It may also be because they were technically limited to actually completely imitate the original. There's a possibility into that. Now, the fact that they changed really the iconography, for example, of the head of the lamb, and also added some elements such as palms on the back, to the virgins at the back. This I cannot answer. I know we've discussed this before, and the question is, why change this very confrontational gaze of the lamb, also an anatomy that may appear not naturalistic, quite schematic, and also this very intense expression may have other reasons, but I just don't have this culture of the history of aesthetics or perhaps theology of other elements to explain this. I think it's really a subject of an open debate. But I think the point of view was certainly not to, of these restorers, was certainly not to cover something that they found ugly or that they found minor, but they were really hiding, they were covering a surface that they looked subdued by many layers of varnishes and also local restoration, which had discolored. They wanted to hide this to make it again look absolutely perfect. It is quite interesting to I think, thought-provoking to notice that they did not cover, for example, this absolutely amazing vegetation in adoration of the Lamb, at least the bottom part where you have all these fruits and these bushes and these flowers. There they are a bit glazed over, they're a bit hidden in some place with a bit of retouches here and there. But no, they stayed away from this. So they did not want to really transform the whole aesthetics of the Ghent Altarpiece. I don't believe that. But what would be very interesting is that during the third phase of restoration, which may start at quite soon, we hope, to see how much there has been changed. Has the face of the divine figure been altered, for example, like the face of the Lamb has been altered? All these elements also to contribute to a very better insight into why these restorers worked in a particular way. Now, if I look back at other interventions, I think in general, the meaning of the restorers was really respectful, but they worked within their own knowledge and connoisseurship, their own skills. And when you compare, for example, the restoration which were carried out in Ghent in the 19th century to those who was carried out in the same period on the wings which had been sold in Germany, you can see that the approach is completely different. It's the same period, but it's completely different. The restorers working in Berlin had been trained in copyists in the collection of the Boisseret, which had a profound admiration for the technique of the early Netherlandish painters and had also an intellectual interest for this technique. And so the restorers were trained really to respect this and to imitate it perfectly in their retouching. Also to not to overpaint or cover anything. So in contrast, the restorer working in Ghent wanted to hide damage. They tried to smooth it out, to fudge it out, but they did not go very much into cleaning. They just hid it, but it was a very different concept, and there was no interaction between these Ghent restorers and curators, connoisseurs of art history who had this broad culture of the evolution of aesthetics. And so we see this very different point of view. So yeah, the quality of a restoration is not only due to the restorers, it's also due to the environment and the circumstances in which they work. I don't know if that's satisfying for you.
Yeah, it's very satisfying. Maybe one follow-up question that, well, I don't know if anybody can answer it, but I'm going to pose it anyway. Why paint? Why do we see this premise of the original, and why is our approach to restoring painting so different from restoring architecture and sculpture and many other tapestry
I don't think this is systematically the case. So every case of restoration, whether it's paintings or also polychrome sculptures, for example, is looked individually. And the importance is to really identify and qualify additions and to understand also the condition of the original and the reasons why this original had been covered or so much transformed. Now, in the case of the Ghent Altarpiece, the reasons in terms of materials were very clear. The damage was very limited, and both areas were overpainted, covering this absolutely extraordinary quality of a unique work of art. And so the quality in terms of unique status between the original and the overpaint was enormous. And that, of course, combined to the fact that the overpaint could be physically removed without damage to the original, also contribute to the fact that it was possible to remove it, of course, with the necessary precaution. Now, I don't think that this is systematically the case. There are other examples of paintings which have been very much restored, but for example, the original then is in poor condition, or the restoration or overpaint are done in a context which is unique in itself. Also, you can think, for example, in the case of the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, not all the refactions were taken away. They was not stripped just to go for the original as it was. Some of them were preserved. Of course, the priority, as I agree with you, was given to the original, but it was not a systematic approach of completely erasing this part of the material history. Another element is that the progress in technology for the macro XRF, for example, but also the high resolution photography, the possibility to compare all this visual data in a very high resolution through the computing artificial intelligence gives us so much more insight into the condition of the original to really fully understand, so we can actually propose to go back to, not of course the original state, because it's never possible to reach it, but at least to recover some of the quality of unique objects. And that is something that contributes to perhaps to more interventionist restorations that they were in the past. Simply, we are able to know more and then to advance very cautiously, but with these facts, know your facts, and then act. And that is a very important point.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I would like to see if some member of the jury wants to add an additional question. I start with you. You have a...
I could pose a shorter question to you, dear candidate. When discussing the structural stability of the panels and, of course, the paint sitting on them, then I'm interested in knowing how would all these years of different impacts have been traceable in your team when you look at it. I'm thinking of can you differentiate between damages endured upon the triptych during the First and the Second World War compared to what happened to it during its period in Paris. And I'm here mainly thinking of the transport to Paris, and I think it's amazing that it took 20 days in November 1815 in a bumping car to drive 350 kilometers from Paris to Brussels with the panels on board. And then they arrived here in Brussels. And then it took another 20 days on a small boat to get them from Brussels to Ghent, those 60 kilometers. The stresses that were imposed on them during this travel and what has happened during the First and the Second World Wars, when you sit in front of the object and you have to treat it and decide on what caused what, can you differentiate between these damages? Will the restoration history help you to be able to differentiate between what you have seen in these instances, which must have been a very stressful experience for this object.
Indeed. Thank you very much for your question. It is indeed very intriguing that the central panels did not, according to actually the reports that were made when the panels came back to Ghent, they were described as being in very good condition. There's no mention of opened joints, cracks, flaking paint, none of it. Although other paintings in the same convoy are described of having some conservation problem, particularly blanching of the varnishes, of distortions of the canvases when it came to canvases. It is very intriguing. The central panels are very thick, as you know. They have not been thinned down. The oak from which they are made of is extremely high quality and very stable, very well worked. There's only there was at the time, and this of course increased in history, some problems in the panel of John the Baptist, which had some softwood along the joint, and which became just damaged by heartworm and was very weak. But there's no mention of any cracks in that area when the panels were unpacked. I think they would have mentioned it because they did it for the other paintings in the same convoy. It is interesting to see actually how these paintings were packed. They were packed, sometimes several in one crate, and mixed with straw, and then put together with waxed cloth or tarpaulin. And the actual cards had suspensions. So the floor of the cards were taken down and was suspended so that they could go through these very bumpy roads, and they also lowered down so they could go underneath the big gates of cities. So it was pretty well thought of. Also, we know from the archives is that the convoys also sometimes made some little detours so that they would avoid particularly bumpy areas of the itinerary. So there was a lot of care in this transport, but also they were left in the courtyard in Brussels under the rain. Rain went into the crates, and still they came out of this all right. It's just absolutely incredible. But there is no evidence that they have suffered, at least at a macro level. Probably these stresses may have accumulated and lead to other problems in the future, but no immediate damages. Now, for the First World War, I'm not aware of any documentation on the condition of the paintings after they came back from where they were hidden. And the panels who came back from Germany had been cut down through their thickness and cradled. But this work, which was done with a mechanical saw, steam-driven mechanical saw, just didn't cause any major damage to the paintings. It's just absolutely incredible. It's a tribute to the quality of the works of the Van Eycks, but also to the incredible engineering skills of Germany at the end of 19th century. It's absolutely incredible. And they came back, apparently, there is no evidence from the documentation I saw that they came back damaged. There were some scratches on the surface, but no problem with the support. After the Second World War, and all the trip being stored in Po, and then in Neuschwanstein, in this mines in Altarpiece, they came back with open joints. And also we know that this famous joint in the panel of John the Baptist opened when he was in the mines of Altarpiece, and he was repaired there. So for the rest, I think, yeah, perhaps we'll see some more, particularly, yeah. We at this stage, I don't know, I can't tell you that there's no evidence of. I can come up with.
Preventive conservation at that time still could work so well.
Yeah.
When we think about the hysteria of conservators nowadays, when we impose on museums.
Colleague Van Riedenstein, you want to ask a short second question?
Yes, just a small question, but small questions sometimes take long answers. So it's something, again, looking towards the future. You have said that analytical data about the original varnish, the materials used for the original varnish, and questions like, was it like we do now, or like they did in the 19th century, varnished over the whole surface, or were certain pigments less varnished or not varnished, just and you have answered already in a footnote some of this question. Some research is now going on, but maybe you could explain for the public in the room what kind of research, and it's financed already by the Giske Strijbersfonds.
Yes.
So that's, again, very, very good news. Yeah.
Yes, a new project has started in January, which was meant to start beforehand, but was delayed because of the COVID. It's a PhD research in collaboration with the University of Antwerp and Professor Janssens, who's present here today, and with the Institute. And it looks at the degradation patterns of polychrome metal foils in the Ghent Altarpiece, particularly the brocades, which are behind the seating figure at the top level.
Already for phase 3, let's say.
Yes, but it's working, of course, on existing samples.
No.
They were actually samples that were taken in 1951, which are being analyzed as a basis for this. We don't know when, for the third phase, hopefully we'll be able to continue this. But this PhD is looking indeed at the layers of varnish that would be applied on polychromy, on gold, and how much there would be interference between the metal foils and these layers, which were applied not only on the brocades, but also on the parts of gilding, and were part of the polychromy. So by looking at this opportunity with the University of Antwerp and going such incredibly sophisticated analysis, that hopefully it will also bring some more information on the nature of the original varnishes.
Yes, because it would be a dream to also look back at the cloth of Mary.
Yeah.
And the pigment there, and could we imagine that it would not be shiny, but just like velour,
Yes.
And then you can dream on.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be very interesting to see how much we can do from this. She's dressed in very high quality blue, and we know that in polychromies or in early Italian paintings that these areas sometimes were not varnished, where the rest was. Whether it was the case in here, that might be something that we can find out.
Question, yes. Thank you.
Thank you for this.
Van Bruan, do you want to?
Yeah,
ask?
I have a small question, or rather a suggestion about the 16th century overpainting campaign. You seem to struggle with the fact that contemporary authors ignore or strongly minimize the overpainting, because De Heer insists in his ode that the colors of the Ghent Altarpiece had not faded in 150 years, while Marcus van Varenwijk refers to Blondel and Van Scorel, but say that they cleaned the painting. And you conclude that De Heer and Van Varenwijk did not fully grasp the importance of the overpainting. However, I think you can also read these texts against the grain and turn around the perspective. And when I have read them again yesterday, and when I read it, I wonder if De Heer and Varenwijk were not full part of this wider campaign to update the Ghent Altarpiece and renew its attractions, and that they were very aware of the importance of the overpainting, but that they deliberately ignored or minimized it to enhance the work's aura of authenticity. Yeah. I think This also fits the other historical data that there's a kind of Burgundian revival, which of course serves Habsburg propaganda around that time.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the overpainting, the texts by the Ode by the Heer, the text by Van Varenwijk, and of course also the copy by Coxey, may be part of the same revival campaign.
Yes, it is. I think it's a very good point. I mean, when I first worked on this, the chapter on the 16th century is one of the first things I worked on, and I looked at this a renovation of the Ghent Altarpiece more from a religious point of view, and looking into the politics of the religious politics of the period, of trying to promote such a representation of the real presence of Christ and during the Mass as being something that had to be promoted against the raising Calvinism. But I think this might be a very naive point of view. What you're saying, I think, is very, very interesting. But I'm not sure whether Lucas the Heere, around 1550, was still very young, and he was in training in Antwerp. So I don't know. Okay.
He was the son of Jan de Heer.
Yeah, he was in this network, of course, and Jan de Heer would have perfectly known what was going on. Yes, I think that's something that certainly can be researched. Yes, it seems now evident to me. At the time, I must say, I didn't know enough to go down that.
It's of course hard to prove, because if they don't write anything, but it's, to me, it makes more sense that they deliberately ignore it.
Okay. What I find quite interesting also is that Van Mander doesn't mention it.
Yeah.
Why does not Van Mander mention it also? Although he mentions the rest. I mean, I don't know. But that's interesting. Of course, indeed the Burgundian revival context, I think, is much more interesting way of placing this overpaint rather than within a political or religious context. So.
Thank you. Colleague Jonker, do you have
No, not really. Maybe. just want to wrap it up. What does it say about art history? The fact that millions of people have been admiring the work, which was for 50 to 70% not the work of Jan van Eyck, but two other painters.
I think you have to not to overstate this. I mean, most of the time you look at the Ghent Altarpiece as a whole from a distance. And that's also part of the interest, the iconography, the incredible complexity of the sources that were used, the skill that was still evident in many parts of the paintings. I mean, in Adoration, I say in the vegetation, but also in the side panels of the open altarpiece, the actual overpaint is very limited to just a few areas. So there was a lot, there was also plenty that was still in the iconography. Exactly as we have found out, my colleagues have found out recently, also reworked in the course of the 15th century. But I don't think, yes, it's a different point. Art history uses different points of view. Art historians are interested by different things. And of course, now I think because of this restoration, also the potential of technology, of looking so much into detail, into things, to the website closer to Van Eyck, to really zoom into paintings, how you can do it also with the Nachtwacht, the Night Watch. At the moment, you just have now a completely different new way of looking at art, which didn't exist before, and which was not a tool that art historians had before, but will become part of the just general approach, I think, to art history.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, to conclude this part, I would like to express my gratitude to all the members of this examination board for reading and answering these questions. So now I would like to ask you if you have further questions to ask. Okay. Then I would like to ask if somebody from the audience would like to ask a question. It's a unique opportunity. Somebody? You can ask it also in Dutch. We will translate, or I think Hélène understands.
Français, ça va.
No. Okay, in that case, now the examination board will retreat to deliberate about the merit of the exam taken by HÉLÈNE Dubois. And we will come back in a few minutes. So please, you can stay here in this room.
Yeah, wear it.
C'est drôle parce que tu étais vraiment sur le bord de ta chaise au début, la question, puis à la fin. Ouais, tu t'es installé moi, j'étais là. Non, c'était vraiment bien. Franchement, ils ont fait beaucoup d'éloges. Ouais, c'est gentil. Pour les photos pour les gagner. Très modeste. La personne qui fait de la restauration, notamment et la hollandaise, là. C'est pour 400 €. On va balayer, c'est ça, c'est vraiment l'intérêt. Balayer, mais... Oui.
After deliberation about the merit of the exam taken by Hélène Dubois to obtain the degree of Doctor of Art Science, the doctoral examination committee has decided that she has passed the exam. Therefore, Hélène Dubois is proclaimed Doctor of Art Science. Registration correctly for the seat of the diploma. So the formal session is completed. You can sit down if you want. Thank you. And I pass the word to the supervisor of this doctoral dissertation, Professor Maximilian Martens.
Dear Dr. Dubois, dearest Hélène, let me be the first or probably the second one to congratulate you. I also have to excuse our dean, Professor De Necker, who wanted to be here, but she had to attend the funeral, but she congratulated you in advance. Taking on a PhD student with the name Hélène can have serious consequences. Although the circumstances were rather different, look what happened in Troy about 3,200 years ago. I am very grateful to Sean that he didn't come with a bunch of Leuven allies to besiege Ghent University. But seriously now, I thank Sean and Nicolas for giving you the time and space during many years to complete this dissertation. For all the time he had to miss his wife and she her mom. In any case, the journey towards this promotion today has been almost as adventurous for us as the epic tales that Homer and Virgil described, with innumerable visits to and profound discussions in the conservation studio and in meetings in the board, of which we were both members since the very beginning, the International Expert Committee, in which you reported systematically on the progress of the treatment and study. Each time you were able to convince the committee of the necessity of the next steps to be taken in the treatment. Each and every time consensus was reached by the overwhelming evidence and clear argumentation you presented to this distinguished assembly of internationally acclaimed experts, many of whom are present here this afternoon, either in person or online, and I would like to welcome them all warm-heartedly. This consensus was reached even when decisions had to be made that were sometimes highly controversial with respect to the usual praxis, but which were daringly innovative and may have changed accepted views on professional ethics in conservation for many decades to come. It would never have happened without your extremely well-prepared presentations and crystal clear argumentation. In the very same vein, you described the narrative in your dissertation with mind-blowing precision and critical assessment. My special thanks go out to all the members of your dissertation committee who are witness of your great achievement. A special thank to Anne van Grevenstein, who from the very beginning of the conservation project persuaded and supported you to take on this opportunity of writing a dissertation on the side of your great responsibilities within the conservation team, during the second phase even as head of the team, and to great expense to your private life. I thank my colleagues Peter van Nabeel and Luc Moens for helping me securing the necessary funding for the concerted research program, the GOA, and of course Ghent University Research Council for granting this funding, as well as FWO for contributing financially to the last phase of your dissertation project. My warmest thanks go out also to the two succeeding acting directors of the Kikirpa, who supported you by granting you valuable time, Christina Keulemans and Hilde de Klerk. Également à tous vos collègues de l'équipe de conservation, Anne-Sophie Augustignac, Isabelle Bedeau, Marta Derovska, Cécile de Boulard, Livia de Peutelbaum, Bart de Volder, Kathleen Frooyen, Jean-Albert Latini, Nathalie Lacquière, Claire Méhanioul, Laure Morciot, Marie Postek, Françoise Rosier et Chris Steyart. Je les énumère tous nominalement parce qu'ils ont tous joué un rôle déterminant en tant que vos sparring partenaires quotidiens. Un mot spécial de remerciement aussi à Iana Sanyova, qui a partagé avec vous sa riche expertise chimique à l'IRPA. Also to colleague Koen Janssen and his team, especially Geert van der Snik, and many others from universities, museums, and research institutions around the world, who have previously contributed to your rich education and more recently to the formation of the insights you have formulated in your dissertation. Of course, within the context of such a long career and such a large endeavor, I do forget to mention people who helped you also, and to whom I offer my sincerest apologies for memory loss and my proverbial absent-mindedness. After all, it is a substantial part of my professional profile. However, my greatest gratitude goes out to you, HÉLÈNE, for reversing academic hierarchy. Let me explain what I mean. The great Dutch cultural historian Johan Huizinga once said that the master's degree, like we call it today, was proof of half-finished studies, implying that obtaining the highest academic degree, the doctorate, was a necessity. The process is a long, extended one-on-one tutorial between the candidate and his or her advisor. When the advisor, who is an expert in the field and without much arrogance, I may consider myself knowledgeable in our shared expertise, learns, like I did, from almost every single page in your dissertation, I believe the highest summit of what academics is all about has been reached. We grant you today a degree that, at least in the English language, does not really exist, the doctorate in art science, It is a Germanism, a literal translation of Kunstwissenschaft. But here in our department, my dear colleague, Marc Leman, the head or chair today, has indeed substantiated this term with his work in systematic musicology and on embodied music cognition. You, with your work, have done so for the fine arts by extending the limits of thoroughly interdisciplinary research. Your work is not art history that relies on other disciplines like scientific imaging, but a true integration of art history, historical heuristics, applied chemistry, history of science and engineering, conservation science, and the in-depth practical and haptic expertise of a scientific conservator. And by doing so, you have not only written a dissertation and earned a doctoral degree, but you have also written a substantial page in the history of our 102-year-old department. When you asked me, with your well-known discreet reservation, why I nominated you as a member of the Royal Flemish Academy of Science and the Arts of Belgium, where you were warmly welcomed by all confrades and consorores, well, that is the reason why I had seen in you a truly innovative scholar of the highest international stature. Thank you, HÉLÈNE, for allowing me to guide you on this adventurous journey.
Thank you very much, Max, for these very, very moving words. I'm, of course, very grateful to you for being my promoter and encouraging me in every step of this incredible adventure. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure we'll keep on learning a lot together. I also would like to thank the Commission, the members of the Commission. You really have helped me clarify really difficult parts of my thesis. I hope that I will continue in this way to clarify myself on my own. You are really, you managed to pinpoint things which I knew in the back of my mind were not resolved. And as always, you know, in French you say scotomiser, you know, you just leave them in the background, you think you've forgotten them, but they're still there. And you pointed them out, and that's for all of you. And I'm very grateful for bringing this to the surface, encouraging me to further this work. Thank you very much for your work. Of course, Max has already thanked, and I would like to thank again Ghent University and the Goa Integrated Project. I would like to thank also the HISCA Strebis Funds, who contributed to also supporting my research, and the FWO, who financed my final year of redaction of my thesis. I'm also very grateful, of course, to Christina Keulemans and Hilde de Klerk, to Cyril Stroh, and to Camille de Klerk, who were head of departments of conservation, and to Livia de Peut for giving me also time and space to finish my dissertation. Your colleagues of the conservation team, you've also all have been named. I think, did you mention Jean-Albert? I get it, yeah. So everybody, I just had also, I had my list, and I think I won't mention you again, but I thought, I thank you so much. I mean, you so really are the basis of the observation we make on the object at every level, all of our conversations, every moment, questioning each other, disputing at lunchtime, just looking after each other through the microscope, discussing all these images and all these aha moments after discussing with you. One of them was with Griet, when Griet told me that the word keuzen actually, her mom used to say that about her texts. And now, of course, all the East Flemish and West Vlaming all tell me keus, of course keuzen. It's clean, it's improved, it's correct, it's not kissing, like some art historians have said before. So thank you, all of you, for your work. You're so inspiring, and I just admire you so much. So that was my long list. I also, of course, thank the colleagues from the laboratories, particularly Jana Saniova, Cécile Glaude, and Alexia Coudray, and from the documentation department, Christina Curie, Catherine Fonder, Catherine Van Acker, Sophie de Potter, and Elisabeth Van Eyck and Bernard Petit, as well as Jochen Ketels, who worked also on the documentation in the first phase, mostly of the restoration. Very grateful to the International Commission of Experts, who also had these very challenging questions, and to the church wardens of the Cathedral of Saint Bavo, particularly to their president, Ludo Collin, for just supporting this project and allowing me to also to do further research into the history of the cathedral through this really wonderful archive, which is kept over there. I also thank many experts who visited us through the years and brought their own input into this project. And of course, the colleagues from this beautiful museum where the restoration has taken place so far, in a studio that was purposely built upstairs, in galleries that were actually sacrificed for us to do our work. Working with you here has been an incredible pleasure and honor and privilege, and you've been supporting us all of the way. It's just amazing to be able to work in such a circumstance. So thank you, all of you, for this. I also would like to thank Irene Chaudis, who helped me clarify my text and who just pinpoint again where things were not clear, and how with her amazing sense of writing, of clarity and eloquence, she helped me so much to formulate areas which were clearly a bit fuzzy. On a personal note, I would like also, in terms of redaction, I would so like to name Ruben Suikerbuik, Bernard Ridderbos, and Claire Toussaint, who have been helping me a lot with their thought-provoking remarks and corrections. On a personal note, I would just like to thank all my friends and family. I pinch myself so I don't break down. And all those who are close, but also very far away, who kept in contact through the years and also over kilometers and miles. And of course, it's terrible. I'd like to thank, most of all, Sean and Nicolas. Sorry. You're my pride and joy. Sorry. You're my rock. Thank you. Now let's have a drink.
HÉLÈNE, wil je een foto met jezelf? Oh ja.
Poi funziona così.
Naar kapper geweest.